join us today for ASCE Text Section webinar titled US 67 Groundwater Contamination Project in the TxDOT Dallas District. Well, I'd like to thank the branches, first off, for hosting the viewing sites across Texas. As the State Association for Civil Engineers, we're happy to provide this service to the engineering community. If you're not a member of ASCE or the Texas section, I invite you to become a member so that you can benefit from being a part of this professional association and the gratifying, and I mean that, gratifying and meaningful volunteer opportunities that it offers. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dallas May. He's my colleague here at LCA. I worked with Dallas on this project. Dallas is a project manager with LCA Environmental, as I said. He's a Texas licensed professional engineer and TCEQ registered LPST project manager. He received his BS in physics, respect for that, from Abilene Christian University, and taught high school chemistry and physics for a time before earning his MS, his master's degree in environmental engineering, which is where I met him at Southern Methodist University. He was in my one of the classes that I teach there, and he was reinventing himself from a physicist right into an engineer, and he's done that quite nicely. He joined LCA shortly after and has now been with the firm about 10 years. The majority of his work experience involves hazmat investigations and mitigation for transportation and infrastructure construction, including designing both electric vehicle charging stations as well as conventional bulk fueling systems. With that, I'll kick this over to Dallas. And as Mike said, I'll be monitoring your questions to be addressed at the end of the presentation. Dallas, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. As Mark said, I'm Dallas May, an environmental engineer with LCA Environmental. And I was asked to share a little story with y'all today that I think you'll find a lot of fun. Our story is broken up into little chapters that I'll read out to you. Our story takes place in a little suburb of Dallas County called Cedar Hill, home to the Fighting Longhorns. Our project site was right along US 67, and specifically right about where the 67 symbol is on the map, right at US 67 and Pleasant Run Road. The initial conditions for the roadway were a pretty typical mid-century highway project. The existing freeway facility included 4 12-foot main lanes, 2 lanes in each direction, and 10-foot outside shoulders, and 320 total feet of right-of-way, one end to the other. The build alternative would expand the existing facility from 4 lanes to 6 lanes, including 3 12-foot main lanes in each direction. Also included in the plans was the addition of a new entry ramp coming off of Pleasant Run Road. No new land acquisitions were going to be needed for this project. All in all, this is a pretty classic TxDOT highway expansion project. And like classic TxDOT highway expansion project, the build alternative schematic concept was approved and passed on to the design engineers. The engineers decided they were going to need to cut back the slope a little bit and install some retaining walls in order to get their 3 12-foot main lanes. Geotech borings were drilled and engineering plans were finalized, and the project went to bid. So they're cutting back this area and installing these two different retaining walls, retaining wall A and retaining wall B. The final roadway cross section didn't actually change all that much. The retaining walls would be about 10 feet high, and just a little bit of cut was ultimately going to be changed from the existing schematic. Just a little bit of slope was going to be taken based on the cross section. But of course, most everybody tuning in today is going to know that there are in fact different types of retaining walls. Our retaining wall that we're being interested in required quite a bit more excavation beyond what would be suggested by the cross section. This retaining wall, in this retaining wall, the space between the shoring and the face of the wall was filled with crushed concrete. So you have the face of the wall and the shoring where they're going to be cutting out. An under drain was to be installed at the base of the shoring. At the back of the construction, the under drain, of course, was placed to collect the shallow groundwater that would be flowing in from the freshly cut rock face. So all in all, it's a pretty simple design. Or all in all, what was originally a simple design, rather, has become a significant modification to the ground. So the engineering stuff is out of the way, and we go to bid. The plans were bid by TxDOT as a cost plus contract. A winner was selected, and construction began in 2017. In the fall of 2017, the contractor began excavating out our retaining wall. Now, with construction full speed ahead, it's clear that the excavation of the slope is creating quite a significant change to the existing ground surface. The geology that was hiding behind the ground is starting to divulge some of its secrets. You can see some clear layers of geology, some sandy clay at the top, some weathered limestone start to show, and alternating layers of competent limestone begin to form. Again, the excavation of the slope of the wall is significantly altering the current geology, the current land surface. We're really cutting back from this road now. And again, the geology is starting to show what's underneath. Here's another picture that shows about 8 feet of clay and silt at the top, followed by a strata of weathered limestone, followed by competent limestone underneath. Right at the top of the weathered limestone, the groundwater is beginning to seep into the project area. This is not a surprise. This was expected. Multiple geotech borings collected in this location showed that groundwater should be expected in this area to seep in. TxDOT engineers were well aware of this and designed this into their retaining wall structure. Chapter 2, the initial release, confirmation, and response. The contractor's employees immediately recognized that the groundwater was pretty funky as soon as they started cutting into it. It had an odor, it had a visible rainbow sheen, and was leaving an unusual rust stain on the limestone. The contractors here did everything that they should have done and everything right. They immediately recognized that something was a problem. They took immediate action to prevent additional contamination release and dug a shallow trench to collect the contaminated groundwater and contacted their TxDOT project managers. The TxDOT project manager is called Environmental E&V in Austin, and ENV in Austin called us out to investigate. That rust staining was particularly interesting. Chemically, what's happening here is that the rust color is indicative of a reduced iron environment, likely from anaerobic microbial decomposition of petroleum in the groundwater. This isn't always the case, but there are processes that can cause this. But in this case, it started to look pretty suspicious. There's a lot of red staining pouring out of the rock. What's nice about this rust is it gave us some very good clues as to where to expect to look for contaminated material, contaminated groundwater. This will come in handy in the future. We'll just put a pin in that and come back. So LTA received our work authorization to investigate the impacted zone, and in December of 2017, LTA determined that the groundwater was seeping from that thin, weathered, fractured ground or limestone approximately 5 to 8 feet below the natural ground surface, and that it did in fact contain petroleum hydrocarbons, likely originating from a quick track service station about 100 feet southeast and up gradient from our impacted zone. Again, the contractors did everything that they should have done. They immediately recognized the problem and they took immediate actions to prevent additional contamination release. But this is still a cost plus contract. And you can imagine that the poor, sad, poor contractor is now sobbing to TxDOT and telling everybody that this is just unacceptable and holding up the project. And so we know that this project can't stop. We run our initial sampling and confirm that gasoline compounds in the groundwater. We do have to protect the public, the environment, and the construction workers from the hazardous chemicals that are now flowing into our project area. And we have to keep the project moving forward. So we come up with a simple plan of site reconnaissance with soil and groundwater sampling, trenching to capture the seeping groundwater. We prepared a soil and groundwater management plan and manage the soil excavation and disposal. Dealing with the soil was pretty straightforward in this case. There's no time to catch someone up, so I personally directed the excavation in the impacted areas and monitored and directed the segregation of impacted soil, which primarily consisted of that layer of weathered limestone, from non-impacted soil, which is most of the other soil. Soil spoils, the contaminated soil was stored on poly and covered up until laboratory testing could confirm the extent of the contamination. All in all, 264 cubic yards of impacted soil was disposed of from this site as Class 2 non-hazardous waste. So LCA received our work authorization on December 5th, and we kept the project going, and we had the wall fully excavated and ready for construction of the retaining wall, and all the soil profiled and disposed of by January 7th. Which brings us to chapter 3, the research of surrounding properties. So we're going to go back in time just a hair to when this project was still in the planning phases. For this roadway project, and for most every roadway project TxDOT has the process to identify hazardous material risks like this, called a hazardous material initial site assessment. So we recommend these hazardous material initial site assessments on all TxDOT projects. It's very similar to an environmental site assessment for commercial transactions. we recommend this even when there's no right-of-way acquisition, or even when a project isn't purchasing additional right-of-way. So this ISA was performed by Hicks and Company, and it included a regulatory database review. Further, in the regulatory database review, our gas station, our Quick Trip, was identified as a potential leaking petroleum storage tank adjoining the site, adjoining the project site. So how come, the question had to be asked, how come we are just now dealing with this during construction? Well, in the ISA, the site was determined to be a low potential for impact. And the ISA read, based on no additional right-of-way proposed from this property, the topographic gradient in relation to the project area and case closure, the site is considered a low environmental risk. Now, as much as I would love to be able to throw a competitor under the bus here, that's not where the statement ends. The statement continues, should design plans change to include excavation activities adjacent to the facility, this site would pose a higher risk to the possibility of encountering affected material. So all in all, this site was not missed in the ISA. Hicks and Company were working with the design schematics that they were provided in the early planning stages, which they included in their appendices in the ISA. And those schematics didn't show at the time that there would be significant cut in the for a retaining wall. That was added on later. They left this note, they left this warning for anybody that would heed it. And ultimately, additional excavation activities is exactly what would happen. So back to the project. Groundwater mitigation strategy. So let's go back to that retaining wall detail. With the soil contamination now taken care of, we still had to deal with the incoming groundwater. The groundwater hasn't stopped flowing. If the wall was constructed as originally designed, the underdrain down here would serve as a collector for the contaminated groundwater and then pipe it and release it directly into the environment. Obviously, that could not be allowed to happen. So the plans had to change. We helped H&TB modify their original retaining wall plans to create a permanent trap and collector, which would collect and segregate the impacted groundwater and prevent it from being released into the environment with the regular stormwater. The modifications worked as follows. We would dig out a new collector trench above the underdrain to collect and trap the contaminated groundwater. The trench would be lined with a HDPE, a plastic liner, to prevent seepage through cracks in the limestone. And a slotted pipe was to be installed in the trench that would carry the contaminated groundwater to a collection sump where it would be accessible to a vac truck. And that way we could segregate off the contaminated groundwater from the clean groundwater and the stormwater. So here's another look. We have a perforated pipe inside a trench that would need to be cut out of the wall. Down here is the non-impacted underdrain. So the next question we would have to answer is, where do we install this? Luckily, we had very good geologic clues with that red staining. The rust staining provided the exact location where the contaminated groundwater was confirmed to be seeping out into our project area. And the contaminated groundwater was confirmed through laboratory testing. If we could just block off just these areas, we could optimize our collection system and minimize disposal cost. We don't want to be disposing of groundwater that isn't impacted. So we focused on just the areas that the geology was telling us that's where the contamination is coming from. The collection system, a clay cap was added at the end to trap the contaminated water that was being collected in the trench. And a shelf was constructed to hold the segregation pipe that runs all the way down the hill to a location where it could be accessible to a vac truck. And that was quite a run, actually. It ended up being over 700 feet to get to the place where it could be accessed by a vac truck. At the end of the new drainage pipe, the contractors would install a holding tank with a manhole, and the holding tank had to be constructed again so that a vac truck could drive up to it and clean it out. Because the impacted water wasn't going to stop flowing anytime soon, and the yellow arrow back here, just to give you a sense of distance, that's our gas station. And you can also see the overpass for Pleasant Run Road. Here's another view of the location for our holding tank. Which brings us to chapter 5, the removal of the overburden and effects on groundwater flow. So how did this happen? And if you're paying close attention, you might have noticed that our contaminated zone doesn't really look like it's all that near to the gas station fueling facility. How did groundwater get from here all the way back over here? Well, if you look carefully, there's another clue in the geology. You'll be hard-pressed to find a more textbook fault than this, especially with the very nicely colored layers of competent limestone. Yeah, humans have not been the only ones moving dirt in this location. At some point in the past, the ground shifted and caused this fracture fault in the limestone. This fracture forced up the limestone near to the gas station and caused a much more complicated groundwater flow pattern. When the contractors began excavating out the side for the retaining wall, they created a new low pressure zone, which would become the highway. That pulled the groundwater back in to our construction zone. Yeah, cutting into the wall, as you see here, created a new low pressure zone for the groundwater to flow into and ultimately empty out into our highway construction. The southern portion of the impacted zone showed decreasing contamination, while the northern zone showed higher contamination of benzene and other petroleum contaminants. All these exceeded regulatory action levels, and the groundwater kept flowing. And concentration began actually increasing in our work area rather than decreasing. So this problem wasn't getting better anytime soon. So with our collection system in place and operational, TxDOT was now going well above and beyond their call of duty in collecting, trapping, and disposing of the contaminated groundwater. The problem was identified in December, and the entire system was designed and constructed and fully operational by February. And more importantly, the contaminated groundwater was not being released into the environment. So great, everybody pat yourselves on the back. We did a good job, right? Except there's a problem. This is an engineered remediation system. Why is it TxDOT's responsibility to clean up the release, to remediate a release that they didn't cause? It was caused by a private business. Which brings us to Chapter 6, negotiations with the TCEQ and the State Lead Program. So TxDOT continued to send out a contractor to clean out the holding tank and dispose of the impacted groundwater for another whole year. Every few months, their TxDOT contractor would collect a sample and run it to a lab. The contamination wasn't decreasing. So we sent Lonnie Gilley, the local TCEQ petroleum storage tank guru, and the TCEQ in Austin, a letter clearly spelling out everything that we knew about the site and everything that TxDOT had done for this site up to this point. And we told the TCEQ that TxDOT wasn't going to do this forever. So we convinced the TCEQ to reopen the LPST case and place this site into the state's LEAD program, which is their leaking petroleum storage tank cleanup program for remediation. After multiple meetings, we have to send another letter to TCEQ explaining that, again, TxDOT is not in the forever business with this, and we will be decommissioning this system very soon. Then, in September of 2019, now remember, we had this system fully operational and constructed in February of 2018. So this is now September 2019. The TCEQ sends out one of their own contractors with the authority to directly investigate the release. And sure enough, just as we predicted, the very high concentrations of benzene and petroleum contaminants were identified in the soil around the gas station and in the groundwater too. These numbers, just by themselves, are high enough to suggest the presence of free petroleum product, meaning a gasoline release in the soil around the gas station. And lo and behold, the soil contaminant concentrations increase in the direction of the gas station. All right, and towards our excavation area. Same with the groundwater. The highest concentration were in the direction of our excavation area. And the TCEQ's contractor confirmed the presence of phase separated hydrocarbon, fuel in the groundwater. So a groundwater gradient was produced for the site by the TCEQ's lead contractor. And if you notice, this is, again, not really an intuitive groundwater direction pathway. As we correctly predicted at the time, this unusual gradient was caused by fractures and the fault in the competent limestone rock. And it just so happened to lead the contaminated groundwater directly to our excavation area. And then, when the contractors began cutting into the wall to install their retaining wall, they released the pressure from the overburden and pulled the contaminated groundwater directly into their excavation area. Chapter 7, ongoing recovery. So in October of 2019, with the highway construction at the site nearing completion, the TCEQ finally agreed to take over the recovery operations from TxDOT. So we asked the TCEQ to keep us posted on the recovery actions. We received regular updates on their weekly recovery events through February 2020, when our work authorization finally timed out for this project. The final groundwater recovery event that we were informed of was on the 7th of February of 2021 and is now being paid for by the responsible party. We did a final site recon on Friday, February 21st, 2021, and received a copy of the final recovery report from the TCEQ on the 25th of February, 2021. And in that recovery report, the groundwater emptying out into our collection system still showed significant contamination. It was contamination that TxDOT didn't cause, but that TxDOT went above and beyond to make every effort to trap, collect, and remediate. And it is contamination that is no longer TxDOT's problem. And you can still see our little collection system quietly hidden away at the top of an unassuming entrance ramp to US Highway 67 in Cedar Hill, Texas. So what's the moral of this little story that I've told you? So the first lesson is to understand how a project changes the geology. Just as considerations must be taken for how mechanically modifying your geology will affect the pressures on the structures themselves, also consider how doing so will affect contaminant migration pathways. And in the event that you have contamination that seeps out in daylight, that contamination must be contained and can't be allowed to be just released into the environment, where it can cause hazards to the construction workers or the public or the environment nearby. Sensitive receptors must be protected. And if your client or TxDOT, for example, identifies that, they don't have to be in the forever business for somebody else's contamination. The TCEQ is an available resource that you can call upon to help hold responsible parties accountable for their own releases, even if it is a release that is entering into your work area. But the TCEQ works on their timelines, and deadlines must be provided to them. Which concludes my little story. And we've got plenty of time for Mark to field.
Thanks, Dallas. So far, I see nothing in the Q&A. If you all would write your questions in there. If you have any questions about what was done out there in US 67, don't be shy.
Well, while we're waiting, I can ask a question.
All right.
So this is for those that might be watching and not work on highway construction. What would this look like if it were a private client and not TxDOT? Well, So all commercial transactions have to, or will need to do their due diligence prior to purchase. And part of that due diligence is a process called a phase one environmental site assessment. And that works like TxDOT's ISA, which allows the potential property owner to identify and understand these types of risks. Now, occasionally, these things also come through for private development. In that case, if the private property owner can demonstrate that they did not cause this contamination, that TCEQ has a program called the Innocent Owner Program. So if an owner is truly innocent and the contamination is not theirs, they can enter into an innocent owner program, which protects them from regulatory trouble. Go ahead, Mark.
No, Dallas, I just want to make sure that we address the questions that came up as you were talking. Maybe you could wrap that up later. The first questions coming in was, let's see, when will the leaky underground tank be removed?
When will the adjoining property? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that tank has been removed, or that it will be. So it may not be the tank itself that was leaking. It could have also been pipes and the dispensers and the pumps. There's lots of different points of failure on an underground storage tank.
All right. Next question is related to that. Were repairs to the tanks in the gas station required? And you can relate that to any repairs in the dispensers and piping and tank.
So we didn't follow up with the private company, the responsible party. They would have had to complete a release determination report and a tightness test, as well as other investigations to determine what failed in their system, and then fix those problems in order to continue to operate as a fueling system.
All right. Next question is, how was the removed groundwater characterized? Where was it treated and disposed? So
it was collected by a TxDOT contractor called Sunbelt while TxDOT was doing it. And Sunbelt themselves profiled and characterized the water and hauled it off for disposal. I would have to look up some of the old tickets to remind myself where they ended up taking it. But there are treatment facilities that specialize in treating these types of impacted groundwater.
There's some special petroleum waste characterizations and some facilities that specialize in taking this kind of contamination, dilute groundwater, impacted groundwater. Next question.
Ultimately, it almost certainly was not taken to a municipal wastewater treatment plant. No, they would not have taken it. It would be a specialty wastewater treatment plant.
Permitted provider.
Right.
Do you know if there are any long-term plans for remediation?
Well, this is the system that we constructed is currently remediating that site very well. It's we've opened up through the construction process, through the construction of the retaining wall, we have opened up a pathway so that impacted groundwater that was sitting back there and still and stable for a time is now entering into the collection system, and that's being collected and segregated separately. So the system that we built is the remediation system, and over time, all that water will eventually flush itself out, and you'll see concentrations decline.
Here's an interesting question. Is the water smart enough to know which underdrain pipe to enter?
Is the water smart enough? Well, I don't know about the water, but the geology is. By understanding and studying the geology that we cut out for the installation of the retaining wall, we were able to identify with pretty good precision where the contaminated water pathways were, and that's where we were able to install the collection system. And also, if there may be contaminated water outside of our retaining wall that aren't a problem, because we didn't cut back into those places far enough for it to pull the contamination into the right of way.
Here's another interesting question. Are there any risk that contamination may not all flow into the capture tank? That's kind of what you're addressing. Do you see future risk contamination flowing past the capture tank and further contaminating the surrounding sites? I would add, Dallas, that if you recall, we put this capture system in between the source point and a receiving stream, surface water stream that we feel is very adequately protected. Go ahead.
Well, remind me what the question was. I'm sorry.
Are there any risks that contamination may not all flow into the capture tank? And do you see future risk of contamination flowing past the capture tank and further contaminating the surrounding sites?
Well, hopefully not. By cutting into the retaining wall, we had our geoscientists out there, and we were able to. I mean, it was pretty clear where the contamination was coming from. Could that change over time? It certainly could, especially if additional modifications are made later. If a storm sewer line is installed under the access road, that would also change things and would need to be addressed. So what does that do? What does that do downstream? Well, hopefully, just with all projects, the downstream is adequately protected.
Here's a question that relates to your geology. The tests shown were fairly shallow. Did you have a hard clay layer in the geology that make you think that contamination would not seep further in the dirt? And I think what's there is a shale, kind of an aquitard. But go ahead.
Right. So let's see if I can show you the good picture. Yeah. So the competent limestone definitely acted as you said, Mark, an aquitard, and we didn't see any groundwater flow or identify any contamination. There were no field indicators of contamination below the fractured limestone and the weathered limestone just below or just above the competent limestone.
I think that's a good answer, Dallas. If you could indulge me for a second, then I'll give you a couple more questions. You're right near a slide that shows some glaze on the seep. You know what I'm talking about?
This here? What? I'm not sure.
Well,
Glazed.
it's where it shows to be kind of a frozen icicle.
Oh, yes. Yes, it was quite cold.
It was quite cold.
The groundwater was flowing out and freezing.
Can you flip that slide real quick?
Let's see. Did we get that? Where is that photo? Oh, well, here you can see how it's so the contractors dug out this trench to try to just immediately trap the contamination that they identified. And the groundwater was freezing up in their trench as they were as we were digging it out.
Yeah, but I think you had a better one than that, Dallas.
I did. Where's it at?
It wasn't very far into it.
That one?
Nope.
But that's all ice.
That's all ice.
That's all ice. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Yeah.
Well, at any rate, Dallas, as you said, it was TxDOT does not check the weather before they pick up the phone and call us out on the site. So they don't worry about old guys like me getting cold. So it was pretty doggone cold that morning. And it's a very unique, there it is, a unique circumstance where where you see a contaminated groundwater seep daylighting that's also frozen. Certainly had never seen that before. I had personally never seen that.
That's not common in Texas.
No, it's not. I thought that there were a few other questions, Dallas. I think maybe those were taken as part of being very related to the same questions. Those were outstanding questions because they show that the audience was really thinking about what we were doing out there and what the long-term consequences could be, and whether we put any thought into this. Here's one more question, and then we could probably stop there. Can the oily wastewater be treated in situ using bacteria? Can the oily wastewater be treated in situ using bacteria? That's the question.
Sure. So the biggest problem with doing that is, yeah, there are in situ remediation techniques like injection. The biggest problem for us is that we were not working for the responsible party. We didn't have access to the tanks. So that's why we had to push that onto the TCEQ so that they could begin to work with the responsible party and force the responsible party to implement those types of injections or dual phase extractions or other processes that they need to do to clean up their act. We can only help fix the contamination that was immediately migrating onto the TxDOT right away.
All right, I would add though to Dallas that what is actually happening is natural attenuation. There's some biological activity. There's obligate anaerobes at work, iron reducing bacteria already at work, remediating the site all by itself. Here's a very interesting question. The final grade of the main lanes probably did not change much during the construction. How come the contaminated plume did not show up years earlier? Dallas?
Well, there's a bit of a debate of whether or not it did or not. We did find a Google Street View photo along US 67 right at that spot that shows a suspiciously extra patch of green grass right right in our contaminated location. A photo is a photo. It's so whether or not it was daylighting already is a little bit of a question. The other potential answer for why it wasn't identified before is because it was stable at the time. It was only when our contractor started changing the ground surface did the groundwater migration pathways really change and rapidly restabilize themselves.
That's right. Okay, since here's another one. These are great questions. Do you know if this contamination site is near any inflow points for a water treatment plant for drinking water? And here's where you can explain how we the TCEQ risk ranks these sites.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't believe there's any usable surface water that immediately flows into a municipal water supply system in that area immediately. It would be the environmental risk would be releasing the contamination into a water of the U.S., not necessarily flowing directly into a drinking water supply. But yeah, the TCEQ, when in their risk assessment for new leaking petroleum storage tanks, takes into consideration things like how close are the nearest drinking water wells, which is a very common survey that's done for new leaking petroleum storage tank sites. And if there are any in that area within a certain radius, those owners have to be notified so that they can test their water and make sure that their water is not being negatively impacted by the release. Again, we were not working for the responsible party, so that responsibility was identifying those wells was not on us. We were working for an innocent operator that was just on the downstream end of contamination. But that said, I'm not aware of any drinking water wells in that area. Yeah,
I don't believe there was any immediate danger to any drinking water wells either.
Right.
Or surface water.
The biggest risk was actually to the construction workers themselves.
That's right.
Being in contact with the groundwater while they were out there working.
Here's a question. Since the owner was identified on the ISA map as low risk, which, okay, we could debate here whether that should have been the case, right? But after this project, does the owner now need to actively fix or replace the UST? What were the fines applied and when do they stop?
So the project, or that site was put into the state LEED program, which is a leaking petroleum storage tank remediation program. So the contract, or the property owner, once the TCEQ took over this project from TxDOT, they were able to require the property owner to start writing checks and paying for the collection and remediation of their release. Luckily for this property owner, TxDOT paid for the construction of their remediation system. So all that was left for the contractor was cleaning out the monitoring wells, cleaning out the sump at the end of the line, which all in all is a pretty good deal for that property owner.
The question of fines comes in only when the responsible party becomes uncooperative, typically, we don't have any direct access to know whether there are any court actions, but we're not aware of any.
I don't think there
Cleanup
were.
enforcement authority. What?
Yeah, I think the adjoining property owner was pretty easy to work with ultimately when the TCEQ sent out their remediation contractor to do an on-site investigation of that gas station. I'm not aware of any hassles the TCEQ had with getting access and for their contractors get out and install some recovery wells as well.
All right, we're just about out of time. We're right on schedule, though. We could take one more question, if there are any. Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Oh, here's one. How is the fault acting now?
Well, fault hasn't moved. Fault's still there. It's still doing it. It's still doing its thing.
Yeah.
It's
so it was a joke. Very static fault for the moment. But
yeah, you could say the fault.
He says, how's the fault acting now? Ha ha. Yeah, but that was something that our geoscientists enjoyed seeing, is that uncovered fault across the face of this as it was cut through, for sure. Seeing no more open questions, and I again appreciate all the very thoughtful questions. Thank you for participating in today's ASCE Texas section technical webinar. And thank you very much to our presenter, Dallas May.